Hey there, students. Here we are in week 7, focused on food, which, if you remember, is my favorite planning and land use topic because it's my specialty area. And you can see I'm sitting in my backyard right now, and I have a little urban agriculture scene going on. Some herbs, tomatoes, squash, greens. It's kind of a new addition to my yard, so it's still taking off. But anyway, I thought I'd film a casual video out here so you can see on theme of urban agriculture, like last week's video, which was on theme of waste. So the key learning outcomes for this week are on D2L, of course, as always, and I'll just say a few things about each one and try to clue you in into what I want you to get out of it and what might be on the exam. So first of all, the week's really about what planning and real estate interventions can do to support community food systems. So before we go into it, you probably need to know what a community food system is. Food system really is the cycle or circle or chain system that connects everything about food from the production side through processing and distribution, retail, consumption, storage throughout that chain. So storage for retail and wholesale, and also storage in the house, all the way through the waste side of it. So whether it gets composted, etc. And so a community food system differs from the global conventional industrial food system, in that it's focused on having benefits for local communities. So that's kind of the difference. And in an ideal world, this would be a closed loop, sort of building on some terminology from last week. It would be a closed loop cycle. But how it really happens is that there's lots of inputs along the way from chemicals and petroleum, and at the end there's waste that's landfilled, and that waste isn't always sent right back into the farm field. So it's not a environmentally closed loop cycle that some of us might dream about. So anyway, what can planning and real estate interventions do? Well, I shared a couple articles with you from ULI, Urban Land Institute, that talked about kind of things like zoning. So Portland has made urban agriculture easy in the city by allowing the production of food in almost every land use zone. And it allows growing in front yards, allows fruit trees, allows a certain amount of chickens and goats, and etc. So that's pretty simple stuff. They also allow the sale of produce at most zones also. That's fairly simple stuff, but Portland is actually kind of an outlier in that in a lot of other cities, they haven't made it so easy through zoning, that the zoning code still restricts some of these uses. There's actually a lot of famous stories from Florida and Missouri and Ohio where somebody was growing a garden in the front yard and got issued all these code violations. So first step, if you're in a community, is just to even make it easy for people, make it legal almost everywhere. Now, there are considerations, of course, like should you be promoting urban agriculture in industrial zones and in commercial and residential zones? So that you have to weigh those with other community goals, right? Other things it can do is create an urban agriculture plan, a big comprehensive plan to understand where it's happening and where it could be augmented and what city roles could happen. Cities can invest in local farms and in urban agriculture sites by providing land, resources, tools, soil, programmatic staff, etc. Investing in distribution hubs, food hubs that aggregate from local farmers and redistribute to try to sort of make it easy for local farmers to find retail outlets, and etc. There's a whole lot planning can do. And on the real estate side, real estate developers can integrate food-related thinking into their projects. So including space for some kind of food production, whether in the form of beds like I have, in a shared condo facility or on the rooftop, or even in single-family housing, including space for community kitchens to process some foods, being thoughtful about places to share meals, and including resources for composting. So there are lots of ways that real estate can particularly support community food systems. And we'll talk more about agri-hoods and food deserts, which are other ways. But so all this beautiful urban agriculture that at least I idealize to a degree, in peri-urban agriculture. So urban meaning agriculture that occurs within cities or city-like areas, and peri-urban being more on the fringe, maybe more suburban and rural type context, but near a city where there's a market. They offer great benefits to communities. Often they're environmentally beneficial in terms of having diverse crops, attracting pollinators, diverse species, being placed to reuse resources, producing local food, and reducing the transportation miles associated with food. Often these farms have other environmental benefits like forest and other plants, et cetera, reusing water carefully. So they may have a lot of environmental benefits and certainly just the kind of green space amenity value. But they also face a ton of challenges that are no surprise to any real estate developer. And the big challenge is simply that in a capitalist land market, food producing land competes with other land and has to pay the same prices for that land, even when their profits aren't as high as, say, industrial development or residential. So that problem creates problems at different scales for community food systems. So American Farmland Trust is tracking national trends in farmland loss and has found over the last 40 years, the USA has lost a tremendous amount of farmland, and a lot of it high-value farmland growing fruits and vegetables near urban areas, because that's the land in the path of development. So we've lost a lot as a country in terms of the best land when it comes to community food systems. Also, I shared a trailer to the documentary The Garden in Los Angeles. It's an amazing documentary and heartbreaking. It's a story of this really cool garden in LA that ultimately was bulldozed and slated for development after a long struggle where the gardeners, many of whom were Latinx, really protested the destruction of the garden, ultimately lost that battle. Although I think the story continues. The last I heard, there's a chance that a version of that garden that some land will be set aside for kind of a new garden. But it kind of just illustrates the point that even amazing urban agriculture projects are often not permanently protected, so as such are at risk of losing out to more profitable financially development. Not a full counting of the 3 E's, but it's just what happens again in a sort of capitalist, profit-driven real estate market where the exchange value for new development often exceeds the use value of farming, to use Marxist terms. I also shared an article from Crosscut about the Seattle area and how kind of peri-urban land also is seeing, and this is true in Portland too, is increasing in its financial value a lot, which is pushing direct market farmers off land and making it really hard for them because they just don't make a lot of money farming. To me, this all raises a big question: is if we, from a sustainability perspective, from a artisanal food and local food scene perspective, want these local gardens and farms, we're going to have to be more proactive about protecting them and enabling access. So those readings kind of dig into that. Then we get into the concept of agri-hoods and kind of evaluating the potential possible benefits and kind of concerns or critiques of existing agri-hood developments. And this is a big topic for real estate developers to know. Sorry, I should probably show you my eyes at some point. So an agri-hood, as described by James Howard Kunstler and in the other articles, is a neighborhood development of some kind where agriculture is at the center of it. Kind of like a golf course community, but with a farm or garden at the center. So kind of a really cool concept, and ULI and other organizations have predicted these are going to be really popular, and they are growing in popularity. There's one down in the Salem area, I believe. So the benefits of them are that if developers are proactive about it during new development, they can also be retroactively added to existing neighborhoods, like the discussion in Detroit, assuming land can be preserved and set aside for food. They can be these community kind of cornerstones, places that the nearby residents maybe pay the farmer for regular vegetable and fruit subscription services, sort of a community-supported agriculture model, where there's maybe the farm delivers to local restaurants. Maybe there's a farmer's market. Maybe local residents have plots in a community garden, particularly if it's more dense housing, that they don't have their own yards. So there's all these ways we could really imagine this working, and if spread out over the entire American landscape, sort of would be a big counter to the loss of farmland, and sort of enable development and protection of farmland to go hand in hand, possibly. So I think there's a lot of really cool potential to these, and I'd love to see developers in the Portland region innovating more on this model. That said, as always, there are some concerns, and a big one simply is that most of the agri-hoods that are studied right now that I'm aware of across the country are pretty elitist places. So, the cost of buying into the community is very high. So the question always when it comes to the equity, the equity E of the development triangle or conflict or of sustainability is, well, who's benefiting? And is this just kind of a bougie thing, which nothing really wrong with it, but I wouldn't say it's promoting deep sustainability or environmental justice. So that's one critique. The Detroit story highlighted kind of another take, which is when the idea of implementing an agri-hood comes into more of a declining city, a city that's declining in population, a Rust Belt city. And again, and who benefits? So in this particular case, racial conflict emerged where a white developer, property owner, was putting a lot of effort into developing this agri-hood and really benefiting from the Detroit vision, from Detroit history, from the idea of the resurgence going on there. And long-time Black gardeners were feeling like, and homeowners were feeling like they weren't necessarily always benefiting, although lots of people had different takes in the story. So I share that story just to show how complicated it can be and to, again, show how the equity part of the triangle can be a tricky one for developers to get right. And a big part is listening with open-minded empathy and seeking out long-term members of historically underprivileged communities to hear their points and do your best to make sure your project benefits them rather than only kind of new, wealthier folks. So I think agri-hoods could be really cool to see more of in Portland, both in kind of new suburban development going on, but also infill projects. So there's a big project, Park Rose Argay, up in the northeast part of the city. And it's some of the sites up there are old farms, actually century-old farms that are probably going to be open for new infill development in the coming years. And I think it'd be really cool if some of that land was set aside in the idea of an agri-hood, and if kind of it became one of the parts of the vision for that future neighborhood. So things to think about. 2 more comments. Another one, a big concept, is food deserts. Probably one you've heard about because it's in the media. But food deserts typically suggest a place where there's limited geographic access to healthy, affordable, nutritious, and culturally relevant food. There's a whole lot more to say about that. In my article, I talk a bit more. But I think the concept of food desert has illuminated a pretty important disparity that particularly lower income renters and people of color experience compared to homeowners, wealthier homeowners, and compared to white people who tend not to live in food deserts. An exception is that also rural dwellers of all socioeconomic classes and races experience food deserts. And it's very different in an urban and rural context. And that is a really important disparity. Portland itself doesn't, by a lot of definitions, doesn't exactly have really terrible food deserts because we actually have a pretty good saturation of various kinds of food retail, grocers, ethnic grocers, restaurants, farmers markets, community gardens, et cetera, et cetera. But people may feel that they live too far from healthy food. And there are also things called food swamps, which is lots of fast food and unhealthy food. But anyway, this is a great opportunity for developers to play a role and for city agencies that encourage redevelopment and infill to play a role and intervene in food deserts. However, my whole article kind of suggests extreme caution when proceeding this way, because most of the problem that people experience with food access actually has very little to do with their geography and mainly to do with their finances, right? Their money. If you've got money, you can get yourself food. You can drive across town to whatever grocery store you want to. You can pay for food delivery. You can do a big trip to Costco once in a while. You'll pay the high gourmet prices at the little grocer down the street. You figure it out if you've got money and you've got access to transportation. So really, if we want to intervene in food deserts, what we have to do is intervene in people's economic abilities. So that means things like focusing on the minimum wage, on labor, on the cost of food, on benefits to people who don't have current work or aren't able to work, so SNAP and other food benefits. So I suggest intervening in food deserts with an anti-poverty approach first, and that any physical infrastructure should be really thought out with a lot of community consultation, and there should be a lot of creative thinking going in there. and it should not necessarily be solved with a Walmart or a Whole Foods that might just perpetuate lots of existing inequities and that aren't always known for treating their own employees very well. So kind of exacerbating the problem. So I suggest a whole potential set of alternative strategies, such as investing in local entrepreneurs to help them expand their options, particularly working with immigrant and minority-owned businesses, working with already existing community efforts to expand them, and again, focusing on anti-poverty. And if there is an attempt to bring a grocery store to the neighborhood, to work on community benefits agreements. So work with that retailer to require certain local hiring practices, wages, environmental practices, etc. So lots to chew on there. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. And then the last concept that I really want you to drive home this week is just how food can get enmeshed in the processes of gentrification. It's probably no surprise to you, but food, it can very much so, because food can carry sort of elitist or certain cultural norms, and as food can often be the first sign of gentrifying in a neighborhood, of the incoming influx of more wealthier, often white, but definitely wealthier, tastes and lifestyles. So we start to see more, sophisticated food eateries. Whole Foods is sometimes seen as a beacon of gentrification. Certain eateries with certain aesthetics, like high-end coffee shops and fancy ice cream cake pop places, or $12, $15 salad bowl places. A lot of what you see actually on Williams in Vancouver, now that I think about it, in Mississippi, Alberta division, you can sort of see there how foodie culture and retail can get enmeshed with gentrification. And gentrifiers may move to neighborhoods because of the food scene. But a whole component that happens here too is the gentrification of renting, of food entrepreneurs, of food retail owners who get pushed out when new businesses move in, or when local residents whose longtime food eateries get pushed out. So Steve Cohen points out in very specific, concrete ways how food can get quite enmeshed in gentrification. And as developers and planners, it's important for us to be careful when we do food-related development, to do all the things that we would do to bring an equity lens, an anti-displacement lens, to support lower-income residents and minority-owned businesses in staying and in coming to places, and making sure we're not just supporting sort of an uppity food scene. Not that there's things wrong with it. I enjoy some uppity food things, but that it's only serving one part of a community, and a part that already has a lot of access to things and doesn't really need a whole lot of planning or real estate intervention to help it necessarily. So as developers and planners, I challenge you to think about how you can better bring a food lens to all your work, part A, but part B, bring a food equity, anti-displacement, anti-gentrification lens also. It's really, that question is really the theme of the class. Bring a sustainability lens and an equity lens. So hopefully you found this overview helpful, and I will see you online.